Greetings. I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to our program, Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. As you know, there is much concern today about the health and environmental impacts of pesticides and herbicides sprayed on our agricultural crops. The issue of agrochemicals is especially linked to certain genetically modified crop plants known as GMOs. Our guest today, Sheldon Krimsky, offers the best professional information about this issue. Dr. Krimsky is the Lenore Stern Professor in Humanities and Social Sciences at Tufts University. He is an internationally recognized expert on the social and ethical aspects of science and technology, and he has a very long list of distinctions and publications. Important for today's discussion is his contribution through books and articles for the public to an understanding of agrochemicals such as glyphosate or known as Roundup, associated especially with GMO crops. We are honored to welcome back Dr. Sheldon Krimsky, and thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome, Yvonne. It's nice to be back in your purview again.
Okay, Dr. Krimsky, to just sort of orient folks about this, the general issue before how these chemicals are linked to GMOs. Could you give us a little background? What are GMOs? What's that general issue?
So GMOs, which everybody seems to know the acronym, is genetically modified organisms, and it could be anything from animals to humans to bacteria to plants. Lately, people have been mostly concerned about GMO plants. Now, what constitutes a GMO is a laboratory-based intervention into the genome of a plant, which makes modifications in the genetics of that plant. There are other ways to make modifications in the genetics of a plant other than from a laboratory bench where you pick out genes and put them in. That is, you can use radiation to make genetic mutations, but that's not considered to be a GMO product.
So when you modify genetically, there are a whole bunch of consequences. Could you explain? So we've done breeding traditionally for a long, long time. And very often those two things are considered equal, GMOs and regular breeding of crops, but they're not. And could you please tell us, what happens there? What's that difference?
Well, there are a number of people, including scientists, who believe that there's no fundamental difference between traditional breeding and what I call molecular breeding.
Yeah.
That is the specific placement of genes in a particular crop. On the other hand, there are, in fact, differences. When you have to put a gene into a plant, you have to add certain things. You have to create a cassette to insert it into the plant. And that cassette is not something you would ordinarily get from a natural exchange of plants hybridizing, let's suppose. So there are some fundamental differences. The real issue is whether or not those differences affect the quality of the plant or its health impacts on humans. But there are some fundamental differences between traditional breeding and breeding through hybridization. And certainly one thing that makes it different is that in traditional breeding, you can't take let's say a gene from an Arctic fish and put it into a lettuce plant. There's no way you're going to be able to take a gene from an Arctic fish that keeps it from freezing and implant that gene into a lettuce plant. That just is not going to happen with traditional breeding. So in molecular breeding, you expanded the possibilities of transforming a plant.
Right. That's one of the really big things, apparently, that and that can't be reversed. Is that correct? I mean, once you do that, introduce a gene from something that is not a plant into the plant, then you can't take it away again.
Well, there's a new technology called CRISPR. CRISPR. It stands for a rather complex term, but it's basically gene editing. And with CRISPR, after you put the gene in, you can use CRISPR to take it out, I suppose. Or if you're in a hothouse, everything's enclosed, and you don't want this plant anymore, you just destroy it, and hopefully it'll never get into the environment. So it may not be totally irreversible, but once it's out in nature, chances are it's going to be out there.
Right. I see. That is, I'll ask that again in a minute about the issue of pollen also from GMO plants that change things in the agricultural fields too. But I'll come back to that in just a minute. So you have this very specific engineering, and then the major crop plants. What are those, please?
Well, in terms of beginning in the 1990s, there was a transformation of corn, soybeans, the big money plants, monocultural crops.
Right.
And there are two fundamental major changes that the GMOs created. One was herbicide tolerance. So that means that you have a plant that you can spray herbicides on and it won't harm the plant, but it'll kill all the weeds, all the unwanted plants around it. That was one major change, which changed large-scale agriculture. And the other was insect-resistant plants, which is instead of spraying the insecticide on the crop, build the insecticide inside the crop so that the insecticide will be all over the crop, and when the insect bites any part of the crop, it will ingest a toxic chemical, presumably killing it. So this was quite a dramatic change. And the hope was that the farmers would not have to use as much insecticides sprayed on the crop. They pay a little bit more money for or maybe a lot more money for the GMO with its own internal insecticide, but they wouldn't have to pay money to buy the insecticides to spray on it.
I see. And then this is so linked with big agriculture, these monocrops, as we say, corn, soy, and so on, right? And then it had huge impact. And there were a couple of things in that. First of all, I'd like to ask about the effect of doing this to the plants, of engineering the plants. Did it work? Did it save us from the insects or from the weeds in the end?
Well, the glyphosate tolerant plants worked for the farmers, and they worked in a laboratory and they worked in the fields. But then something happened, and that is that you use so much glyphosate, and the amount of glyphosate used in the world was beyond what it had ever been used, because it was used all over the world except in certain countries in Europe. And nature has its way of reacting. So the weeds became themselves resistant to the glyphosate.
Yes.
So therefore, it's like using too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. Use too many antibiotics, and all of a sudden,
Right.
they won't work on you. You'll develop resistant bacteria. So that became a big problem. And then the farmers had to figure out what to do with that particular problem. The other thing was that glyphosate was first synthesized around 1950 by a Swiss pharmaceutical company, but it had no applications that anybody could find for pharmaceuticals. By 1970, Monsanto had access to that chemical, and they found that it was a phytotoxicant, that it attacked plants. So by 1971, that discovery was made by Monsanto scientists. And by 1974, they had a patent on a glyphosate formulation, Roundup, which, as most of us know, is the most widely used herbicide in the United States. And you go into pharmacies and you'll see big canisters of Roundup being sold in a drugstore.
Right.
So that was the trajectory of Roundup. And during the early years of the 1970s, when it was submitted to the EPA for approval, EPA finally gave it approval in 1974. There were very few studies, very few studies. Monsanto did the studies, and they submitted them to the EPA. And EPA considered it to be a very safe herbicide. But as the 1980s and 90s came, more and more studies took place, and people began finding adverse effects of glyphosate, not only on humans, on mammals, but on all kinds of other species.
Yes. I understand. I want to just underscore something first here, and that is I think you alluded to a kind of backfire from nature there. When you start using something like this, like Roundup, nature adjusts to that. I think there were weeds that sort of came back in force. Is that true?
Right.
So this is in the fields.
The weeds mutate spontaneously in nature, and they became tolerant to the chemical that was designed to kill them.
Yes. And yes, so that is one of the things that sometimes doesn't get out there. Another thing now with the glyphosate, as you said, it was considered safe for a long time, and we have many problems with that I'd like to get into more in a minute, that is that a lot of those studies were done by the corporation, in this case Monsanto. The EPA just accepted that, and I would
or they were paid by Monsanto. In other words, the studies were paid by Monsanto, or they were done internally by Monsanto. And there may have been other studies that EPA used, but EPA felt that the weight of evidence was in favor of glyphosate. And they said it was likely not a carcinogen to humans. It was likely not. But then everything changed in 2017.
And before that, then, were there good quality crops? This was a major advertisement from Monsanto, was that you would have a greater number, that the quality would increase and the quantity would increase. And so you often see almost advertisements when they talk about GMOs that we can't survive without this in modern agriculture. Were the crops of better quality? Were they necessary?
Well, I think the purpose of glyphosate tolerance was really to protect the agricultural field from weeds. Weeds take away some of the nutrients that would ordinarily go to the crops. So you'll get a greater, richer crop if you don't have weeds, because they're not extracting the nutrients from the soil. So at least at first, before there were resistant weeds, yes, that's exactly what happened. It is not designed to create a more nutritional crop. That's not what glyphosate tolerance is designed to do. The early work on GMOs had nothing to do with making a better tasting or a more nutritious crop, but making a higher yield.
Yes.
With less, impact on the agricultural field. That was the primary function. It was to help production, to help agricultural production. There are other, applications of GMOs that we could talk about, which fall into a different category, which actually are designed to maybe improve the crop.
Well, that's another issue I'd like to ask about right now, and that is the famous golden rice. Apparently, that kind of modification. So the word was that this golden rice, and I'll ask you to explain it, then that was really going to change things dramatically, and that kind of reinforced the virtues of GMOs. Could you tell us what that as an example, or any other example?
Well, by the 1990s and throughout the 1990s, there was a world tsunami against Monsanto and against GMOs. And, the corporations, not only Monsanto, but other major corporations that were using GMO products wanted to find a way to turn the public's mind away from the negativity of GMOs. And one idea around 2000, after a scientist discovered that they could put a precursor to vitamin A into rice so that communities that don't have access to leafy vegetables would get the benefits of vitamin A, because vitamin A deficiency was a significant disease in Africa and in Asia, and it causes blindness if it affects children, and sometimes it leads to death. So the idea was to genetically modify rice to put in a precursor for vitamin A, which when the body ate the rice, it would turn it into vitamin A and everything, and this could address vitamin A deficiency. That was in 2000.
Yes. Did it work?
Well, it took about 20 years with all kinds of testing. Finally, it was approved in the Philippines, and the United States Food and Drug Administration has accepted it as safe to use. So it is being marketed in countries that, or at least in the Philippines, for addressing the vitamin A deficiency issue. But it has been accepted fairly recently, so we don't have any long-term studies yet. I'm sure there will be.
Okay, so that was one example. I just wanted to throw that out there to begin with. because
we have to be open-minded and say it might work, and we have to evaluate the long-term effects, whether there are any unexpected effects on the people who consume it, and whether or not, in fact, it does what it's supposed to do, namely prevents vitamin A deficiency.
Okay, so that was one of the big sort of advertisements for GMOs in that case, and it's only really recently been launched as a crop. I take it, it took so long, but I'd like to now kind of go back to glyphosate and the health impact, which initially, I believe, when they started using glyphosate, they insisted it was very safe, and that they did this, of course, with DDT also, don't worry about a thing, but things sort of went off the tracks, I think. What are the health impacts that are known, say, of glyphosate today?
Well, first of all, the issue really got triggered in 2017 when the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a WHO organization, did a study along with other industrial chemicals. They periodically will do a toxicology study, not a laboratory study, but a study of studies to reach a decision as to whether or not the subject that they're studying is a carcinogen. It is, after all, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So they're interested in cancer. And they spent about a year with an international panel. This panel was selected so that they didn't have any conflicts of interest. There are very strict rules about that. And in 2017, they came out with a study that said that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen, based mostly upon animal studies, but also upon human studies which were not definitive. But because the human studies were not definitive, but suggestive, the animal studies they felt were definitive, they classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen, which on the scale, on their scale, there are 5 elements on the scale. Number 5 is it is a human carcinogen, and number 4 is it's a probable human carcinogen. And then from there it goes down to the evidence is it is not a, all the way down to the bottom. So it was closest to the top. And this caused a great international, row of, especially in the industry, because this was the first major agency which linked glyphosate to human cancer. And at the same year, EPA said it was not likely a human cancer. So you have 2 agencies at opposite ends of the spectrum.
Right. One of the issues with the EPA, the FDA, I assume people might know that there is a lot of corporate, what shall I say, influence. And oftentimes people from those corporations are serving in the regulatory agencies, and then and it's kind of what's called the revolving door. So that has been a problem. And so different times, I think the EPA may have ruled one way or another, but it's just something to keep in mind. Dr. Krimsky, in terms of the glyphosate, I know about the non-Hodgkin lymphoma cases were rising in certain populations exposed to the glyphosate on a larger scale, I guess. And were there other cancers that were of interest there?
IARC did not find any other cancers but non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that they could
Okay.
rule on. That was the only one they could rule on. And after they issued their report, 2017, the state of California placed glyphosate on a list
Okay.
in which they wanted everybody who used it to know that it's a probable human carcinogen. They took IARC's recommendation and wanted to list it, and then a number of lawsuits started to emerge. Applicators of glyphosate who had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and other people who used it quite a bit brought cases to the courts. So in the courts, the attorneys were then cross-examining the experts, and the juries had to decide who to believe. And in a few of those cases, the complainants who brought the case to the court had won sizable settlements. So the juries were apparently listening more to the IARC specialists and others who supported that result than they were to the Monsanto experts.
Okay, good. Then, so there is that health issue, maybe not entirely resolved, but that has been more prominent. And I understand that, as you say, there are many, many cases out there suing because of this. And I know there's a difference between what the EU does or the European Union's treatment of this issue and the American issue, but I have to go on to the economic impact and then the environmental impact. So we have a health impact. What about the economic one? And there I'm asking about corporate profits and the resulting seed monopolies and the patent issues there. Can you help us out?
Well, there's a lot in what you just
I know, it's just in general, the economic
of course,
impact of this, yeah.
patents for GMOs last for about 20 years, and the patent on glyphosate was over, so many companies can now produce variations of it. One of the things that the public should know is that when a herbicide is created, it's not used, pure glyphosate is not the herbicide. It has other chemicals associated with it. And some of these other chemicals have different functions. For example, something called a surfactant, which is a chemical that allows the herbicide to stick to the leaves of the plant. It turns out that some of the other chemicals, we call them adjuvants, they're added on to the primary chemical, are more toxic than glyphosate. And you should also understand that IARC studied the entire formulation of glyphosate formulations. And the EPA, they only studied the so-called active ingredient, glyphosate. So they did not study the formulation. And that would be a reason why EPA found glyphosate to be less toxic than IARC. But we now know from independent studies that some of the add-on chemicals, the adjuvants, are highly toxic. And yet the glyphosate would not be very functional if it were not for some of these chemicals. So the public, and this is true with a lot of pesticides, where the EPA evaluates only what they consider to be the active ingredient, and all the other ingredients are left on their own.
Dr. Krimsky, do you know if there's a difference in evaluating in the EU this issue as opposed to the United States? When they look at the EPA ignores some things here in the EU, do you know offhand if they look at the whole picture there, these agents?
Well, the studies at the EU were designed to look at both glyphosate and the formulations themselves.
Yes.
And I do know that IR took into consideration the formulations as well. So there's a different perspective in the EU. And they also have a different attitude about evidence and when to ban or when to restrict a chemical. In the United States, our system of chemical review, basically you have to prove the chemical is unsafe. Which means it's difficult sometimes to prove the chemical is unsafe in order for the EPA to act. Now the pesticide laws are different than the laws to restrict chemicals in commercial products.
I see.
TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, is designed to restrict chemicals in commercial products. But let me give you just a hint at how that worked. For 40 years, TSCA was first passed in 1976, and it wasn't revised until 40 years. The way that worked was a manufacturer would produce a new chemical that they were going to be put into a commercial product, and EPA had 90 days to prove that it was unsafe. And if they couldn't prove if it was unsafe, then it would go on the market. It is estimated that there were 86,000 chemicals in industrial production, 86,000. And over 40 years, only 6 of them were banned.
Yes.
6.
Yeah.
So the burden of proof to get rid of a chemical is very high. It's not, that's not true in Europe. They have what's called the precautionary principle. If there is suggestive evidence that a chemical is dangerous, you ban it first and then you test it. And if it proves safe after the testing, then you can put it in the market. That's very different than the American approach.
Yes, I thank you very much for that information. That's extremely important in considering this issue particularly. But I have another thing on the economic impact of these things. There was another element that was maybe skipped a lot, and that is how these seed companies could then patent these genetically modified seeds and then told farmers that they couldn't use their own seeds that they had accumulated over the years. This created a monopoly, I think. And then there was the double issue of the patent on these GMO things, on living, on biologically altered. And the other is the monopoly putting the farmers in really at. Can you help us?
Sure. When you buy a patented object in a store, it's yours. You can use it, and you can use it in any way you want. And if you decide you don't want to use it for 1 year and use it for the next year, you can do that. If you want to sell it to a friend, you can do it. The microwave oven may be patented, but you could sell it to a friend or give it to a friend, right? Not with seeds.
Right.
Okay. So the farmer buys the seeds, he signs a contract. And the contract says you can't save the seeds. If you don't want to plant all the seeds 1 year, you better throw them out because you can't save them for the next year.
Right.
Small farmers in developing countries, saving seeds is all part of their business strategy. So this was a big issue, one issue with that. And then, of course, the patenting of seeds came about after 1980, when the Supreme Court allowed the patenting of a microorganism.
Yes.
The Chakravarti case. And there was protection before that for people who developed seeds through other methods, more traditional methods, hybridization, etc. But it wasn't anything like patenting.
Mm-hmm.
So with patenting, you can't reproduce the seeds. You have to buy new seeds. So it would be sort of like you buy a CD, okay? And the company says, well, you can use the CD and you can listen to it, but you can't make a copy of it. Can't make a copy of the seed. You can't make a copy of the CD. So the seed was almost like, you're renting it from the company, basically. And you use it for planting, but nothing else. So it's a different kind of agricultural business operation. And as far as I know, it still remains that way.
Right, right. Well, another thing was that it put a lot of small farmers out of business because they were forced to buy the GMO seeds, and I think, and then they couldn't, say, experiment with their own seeds. And in addition, maybe the pollen from the GMO plant would contaminate their fields and so on.
There was an interesting Supreme Court case where one farmer bought some Monsanto seeds and paid, a nice price for them. They're costly. He planted them. He wanted to have a second planting season, but he didn't want to spend all that money for the GMO seeds. So he went to a granary and he got a bunch of seeds from the granary, and he knew that in that barrel of seeds, there would be some GMO seeds.
Yeah.
And he was able to plant GMO seeds from the granary. And he planted them. And Monsanto found out that he planted GMO seeds that he did not buy from Monsanto, and they sued him. And he used the argument that when I buy a patented object, it becomes my own. I can adapt it. And the Supreme Court said, yes, but you can't reproduce it.
Aha. And there's the difference.
There's the difference. And they said, well, by planting it, you're reproducing it, and therefore you violated the patent.
Yes. And which has given extraordinary control. So there were two things with these GMO seeds. This aspect of really monopoly, just out flat monopoly of the seeds, and the other being the consequences of using very high levels of the sprays, of the pesticides and so on, and especially with glyphosate, and then the health issues that resulted from that. Dr. Krimsky, I think there were environmental impacts from all of this as well that I guess are linked to just big agriculture anyway.
Yeah.
But did this really help the health of plants, so to speak? Did it really become something we couldn't do without the introduction of the GMOs?
Well, couldn't do without.
Yeah,
Always depends upon what your bottom line is and how you view your business model. We obviously did without these things before the discovery of recombinant DNA, or now CRISPR. We did without them, and we fed our populations. The question is, we're in a different world now, 7.5 billion people, and we need to make sure that we can feed all those people. The question is this the way to do it? Certainly, there was a change in concentration of seed companies.
Yes.
And Monsanto bought up a huge number of small seed companies and turned them into part of its seed estate so that they could use GMO seed. There are a few nations that absolutely ban GMOs. Mexico doesn't want to have any GMO corn anywhere near Mexico.
Yes, that came out last week. Yeah.
Because of the contamination of their traditional corn varieties. And that's the other aspect of it. Having variety of seeds is a very important thing because any one type of seed could go bad with, contamination or virus or something like that. And you want to have variants that can be used in case one variety becomes useless. So the question is whether or not having a GMO product that you want to put all over the world, which isn't based upon the indigenous varieties of each community, is going to be a good thing to create the biodiversity that is really needed on this planet for the future. And this takes us into issues of sustainability.
Exactly. The next question. Absolutely. That is just very briefly there. Thank you for that information. And thanks for bringing up the recent case of Mexico. Nobody, I think, realized they could really fight back like that. Mm-hmm. And that was a considerable triumph because that diversity is so important. But also this whole issue of sustainable agriculture, we don't have a lot of time left. And I'd really like to get the good background on this. This is a whole thing right now. What is sustainable agriculture? And then how do these companies that produce the GMOs present an argument that they are helping sustainable agriculture?
Yeah. Well, there are usually three cornerstones for sustainability. One is the social aspects, the economic aspects, and the environmental aspects. So sustainable agriculture is supposed to support the small farmers as well as large farmers, and it's not supposed to be selectively against one or the other, developing farmers versus farmers in developed countries. So that's the social aspects of sustainability. Environmental aspects is the methods that you use for agriculture should protect the environment, should not have adverse effects on non-target insects or species that are important for biodiversity. So that's also important. And the third is that it has to support the economics of the farmer. So it has to be economically viable. It has to, support the social conditions and the environmental conditions. Those are the three parts of it. And the very first statements about sustainability also had to be linked to the future. That is, what you do now should not eliminate options for people in the future. Mm-hmm. So that is, you shouldn't be creating a future that people will not be able to survive in. You should be leaving what you have sustainable for the future as well. Don't eliminate species now for your own benefit so that the future cannot have access to them. So these are the three things. And I think the industry is focusing on only one of them, and that's the economic aspects of it. If it serves the farmer economically, then they view it as sustainable. But they don't often look at the environmental effects on non-target species, biodiversity, and also on this sustainable social aspects of it. So for a full range of sustainability, you have to look at all three.
Right.
Austria has banned GMOs, and they did a study of sustainability, and they said, well, they said GMOs do not meet our standards of sustainability. It may actually improve the yield, but that's only one part of it. And therefore, it cannot meet the other standards that we have. So they banned GMOs.
Okay, here's another thing in sustainable agriculture, I think, is the treatment of, say, the soil, the whole farming complex there, that the GMOs and their association, close association with the big ag, with these monocrops have been, it's involved tilling, and sustainability sort of is no-till. For the most part, I know that these definitions vary, but can you have this GMO big agriculture? Can you have that and have, say, no-till, no insecticides, all the rest of that?
Well, it is certainly a balance for the farmer to be able to. There is a certain kind of tillage which is dangerous because it really does erode the topsoil and requires a lot of input, a lot of input of chemicals on the soil but there's also a certain type of tillage which has very low impact. So it's not just no-till or till. There's conservation tillage, which is much more favorable than just outright overturning the soil. And of course, glyphosate was advanced as a no-till solution. You don't have to turn the soil over because glyphosate will kill the weeds. But it also does a job on the microbiome of the insects, and it changes the ecology of your farming system and severely damages the soil. Many studies have shown this, so that the no-till might not be a sufficient add-on for what the other effects of the glyphosate-based herbicides do. And there's quite a number of effects, including its effects on the monarch butterfly, because they kill the food for the monarch butterflies, and also for bees, where they're damaging a bee population.
Right.
And the bee population has been declining significantly. So, overall, the overuse of a toxic chemical cannot be a positive thing. There has to be ways of delivering the food other ways. And the other thing is this BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, is a pesticide. It's a natural pesticide, and it's been used by organic farmers, and is one of the few pesticides that's allowed by organic farmers. Yes. But because it is pervasively used in the plants, BT corn, BT soy, etc., its use for organic farms has been diminishing.
Yes.
Because it's been overused.
Yes.
So that's another consideration, whether or not having the pesticide in the plant, having that pesticide in the plant. When organic farmers use BT, they use it sparingly.
Yes.
They use it when they need it.
Yes.
But when it's built into the plant, it's always there, and therefore creates great pressure, mutation pressure on the bugs. So the bugs are getting resistant to
Yes.
BT, and therefore they
So
become
the weeds are triumphing and the bugs are triumphing, or something rather. Dr. Krimsky,
yeah.
Dr. Krimsky, I'm sorry, we are really short on time here, and I really appreciate this. We have a lot of information from you today. I very much appreciate it. I would like to bring up again that you have produced at least 2 books for the general public. The last one being the last one is the one that sort of tries to give both sides of the story very, very, very carefully, but it's organized in such a way that it answers questions. You raise the important questions and answer those important questions. And I urge people who are interested in this subject, and it affects virtually all of us, that to look at these books. And
that one is called GMOs Decoded.
Exactly, the last
GMOs Decoded
most
by MIT Press.
Right. And thank you again ever so much. I'm sorry that we've run out of time here, but your information is just excellent. And thank you ever so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.